The Oregon Education Investment Board will come to order. Seth, would you please call the roll?
Governor Kitzhoffer.
Here.
Nancy Goldman.
Here.
Julia Brim-Edwards.
Here.
Ron Curtis.
Here.
Matt Donegan. Samuel Henry.
Here.
Nicole Maher. Mark Colville.
Here.
David Reeves.
Here.
Ron Saxton. Mary Spiley.
Here.
Kay Turan. Hannah Vendry. Dick Whitnell.
Here. Very good. It's just as a first order of business, some of you may have read an article in yesterday's paper concerning Dr. Cruz being mentioned as a finalist at a university in New York, and I just wanted to give Dr. Cruz an opportunity to speak to that in front of the board.
Thank you very much, Governor. Members of the board, Governor, it is indeed true. I am a finalist for the position of president of Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn, New York. It represents not an interest in leaving this job at all, but rather the request of a dear friend and one other colleague, both of whom are from New York, to essentially at least be considered for a position that was in tremendous need of leadership in what essentially is one of the remaining very, very important and culturally rich, diverse communities of New York City. I did so. I did, in fact, say that I could, that I would, in fact, be considered for that. I have not in any way, shape, or form indicated that I will, in fact, take this position, but rather that I would at least just be considered and would take a look at it. It does represent home. It does represent a match in at least my knowledge of that portion of the world, and certainly a connection, an operational connection with young people in Brooklyn, New York. Those of you may know, I've obviously spent a fair amount of time in New York, both as a student and a young person growing up, and more recently as chancellor. I have family in that part of the world, and so for all those reasons, I decided I would at least take a look at it. That's what I've done.
Thank you. We would next need a motion to approve the minutes of the May 4th meeting. So May 14th, excuse me. Moved and seconded to approve the minutes of the May 14th meeting of the Oregon Education Investment Board. Is there discussion? Objection? Who's joined us on the phone there, by the way?
This is Nicole.
Hey, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Can we hear this newest member of your family speak? Any comments?
I'm sure you'll be hearing him shortly.
Very good.
But we'll try to keep the phone muted.
Very good. Thank you. I just want to, some of you may know this, but on June 3rd, our friend, Gavakami Ramajani, died suddenly back in Minnesota. And really a great loss. He had adopted Oregon as his second home. He loved Oregon. He loved working with us on transforming healthcare and education and public services in general. His was a gentle spirit, a big heart, really a compassionate human being, and we miss him very much. And I think he would want us to continue to drive forward with these transformation changes we're working on. So I just wanted to just offer that for thought and reflection. We'll start with a legislative update. I'll give you an update of where I think the budget process is, but it's a moving target from day to day, and then Van can give us a little update on the priority bills. First, let me say, just in terms of the larger debate, we had a $270+ million increase in the general fund in our forecast, which was very, very good. We could probably go home with that. But I think we need to remember that we came from a $3.5 billion revenue shortfall just 2 years ago to a slight uptick in our forecast, which is good news, but in no way mitigates the disinvestment that our system of public education has suffered really over the last decade. So as part of this effort to trend down the cost of the public employees retirement system, which is, again, not based on anything but the market impact that had on the fund. It increased the long-term actuarial liability, which is what's driving up the cost, and it's created a cost driver in our education system. We're working on a package that would address that, but there's also an investment side. So the problem in our public schools is not just a cost problem, it is also a revenue problem. So the proposal that I've been trying to craft involves a significant reduction in that long-term unfunded actuarial liability and around another $270 million, which would accomplish the following. Even if we were to go home with the revenue forecast, there are a number of districts, Eugene, for example, North Clackamas, Beaverton, Hills Group, and Myrtle, that will still be laying off teachers and whittling away at all their school days. For an additional $150 million, we can virtually guarantee that all of our school districts will be held harmless and get us to the point where we can begin to reinvest. That's a K-12 number, $6.7 billion in the state school fund, plus the PERS savings is approximately about a $7 billion investment. It would be an historic budget in two ways. One, because of its size, but secondly, there's no one-time money in it like we had in the past. So this is really a floor that we can begin to build on. In Eugene, for example, which is one of the more challenging districts, I've been told that they would have to use some of their remaining reserves in addition, but in addition, that would mean no more teacher layoffs, no more furlough days in the first year of the beginning. In the second year, they would begin to start building back. So that would be very, very good news. We'd also like to put another $80 million in our post-secondary system. Hopefully some of that could be used to mitigate tuition increases. And then the other piece that I think is very, very important for our agenda is trying to fully fund the child mental health program. So we're still having conversations. It's one of those interesting situations where I believe there are votes in the chambers, not all of them from one caucus or the other caucus, if we can get these bills to the floor. And I think the parties are sitting across a table and they can actually reach each other. We just have to get them to shake hands. The other part of the budget of interest to OEIB are our strategic investments. As you know, we had started with the teacher effectiveness investment of $120 million. We've reduced that to 60, which we still think we can do, plus the investment in third grade reading, academic support for post-secondary aspirations, and science, technology, and math, and the arts. So in combination, it's a $90 million package. We've got about $60 million in the general fund, and we're working diligently to try to make sure we get that full investment. I think it's just incredibly important that this budget not only sustain our current system, but also begin to transform it, and these were the priorities of the OEIB, and so we're continuing to work with the presiding officers and the co-chairs to see if we can end up in good shape with those investments as well.
Great. And ask Whitney, Chris.
Thank you, Governor, members of the board. For the record, Ben Cannon, Governor's Education Policy Advisor, with a brief update on some of the bills that are moving forward or not this legislative session. First, just to note, related to the strategic investments and in particular the network for teaching quality that this board proposed, the governor spoke to the lack of full funding so far in the co-chair's plans for that network. They have, however, moved forward a bill that funds that network at $33 million, and it's worth noting, this is House Bill 2506. It's passed the House. It would fund the network through 3 carve-outs from the state school fund, $14 million from the ESD portion of that fund, $14 million from the school district portion of that fund, and another $5 million from an existing carve-out from the state school fund that is currently appropriated to support capital projects at school districts. So that piece of work, House Bill 2506, moves forward to support the strategic investment that the OEIB and the governor developed related to the network for teacher quality. In other news on early childhood, I'll talk about early learning and higher education pieces, and then Whitney will talk about achievement compacts. On early learning, House Bill 2013 and House Bill 3231, I should say 2013 is early learning, 3231 is the Youth Development Division. Both of those bills moved out of the subcommittee on education, the Ways and Means Subcommittee on Education this morning, so they are moving forward in the process. The early learning bill to create the local hubs through which early childhood services will be arranged and delivered locally. House Bill 3231, another priority for the governor and OEIB that establishes the Youth Development Division within the Oregon Department of Education. We expect a sort of similar bill, House Bill 3234, to move through the subcommittee tomorrow. That is posted for work session, and expect that tomorrow as well the subcommittee will take up the budgets for the Higher Education Coordinating Commission and the Oregon Education Investment Board. So lots of work moving forward this week in the Ways and Means Subcommittee. Higher education, the governor's priorities remain Senate Bill 270 and House Bill 3120. Collectively, they create institutional boards at University of Oregon, Portland State, and an option for an institutional board at Oregon State University, and then a Higher Education Coordinating Commission, a repurposed Higher Education Coordinating Commission to provide state support for our higher education system through funding formulas, through program approvals, through policies for coordination among the community colleges, the universities, and our financial aid programs. Those are big 150-page bills full of potential and proposed amendments, both of which remain parked in the subcommittee on education for the Ways and Means Committee, and we're continuing to work with the co-chairs there and of the full committee on a path for moving those forward. So you'll see in the latter half of latter kind of 2/3 of the legislative update a variety of other bills, some of which I've mentioned in previous updates to this board, and where their status. A number of bills at this point have died officially by failing to get scheduled or worked in a policy committee. So that includes, for example, the bill that would have added members to the Oregon Education Investment Board, and that bill did not move out of the Senate Policy Committee. And there are a variety of others here described that I'm sure one of us can speak to if there are questions, but I'll let Whitney talk about achievement compacts and legislative changes proposed and likely moving forward relative to those.
Whitney Grubbs, Policy Advisor to the OEIB. So I just wanted to update you on House Bill 3075, which touches a number of subjects, but most relevant to you is the impact it has on the K-12 achievement compacts. So this bill was put forward by the Oregon School Board Association also in collaboration with COSA. We did not have any objections to the bill, and what it does is it moves the deadline for the K-12 and ESD achievement compacts from no later than June 30th each year to no later than October 15th each year. And this came about really as a result of having gone through our first year of implementing achievement compacts and having somewhat of a dissonance in sort of how schools actually go about doing their planning and their budgeting when the data on student performance actually comes out. And so it was sort of decided that fall made a lot more sense. They would be able to have actual data from the year prior in front of them. So this bill has passed both houses and is on your desk, I believe, awaiting signature. It takes effect immediately upon signing, and so it will move the deadline for this school year. Many districts have already submitted their achievement compacts. OEIB has worked with Rob's staff at ODE on creating an online submission format this year, which is making it a lot easier for the 197 school districts to actually do this work. And our plan is to leave this online submission open until the end of June. Go ahead and close it over the summer. When we have new data from 12-13 in the fall, September 6th-ish, ODE will upload that data, and then school districts will have the option of either revising their compact or submitting it for the first time if they haven't already done that. What this will mean for this board is that we won't have compacts to share with you until probably the third week in October, maybe early November. But that's how this work will go out. There will be an official communication from the Chief Education Officer out to the field There's a potential that we'll need to do some revision of the permanent rules that this board adopted implementing those compacts. We're looking at that now so that when the legislation is enacted into law, we'll be ready to bring back more to you. But for now, we'll do an official communication to the field. We've also contracted with IMESD, this amazing school district, or ESD in Eastern Oregon, yes, to do the support work for us. So they're actually operating a help desk to help field the many questions from the field around compacts and other issues.
Please.
Will this affect higher education community college community achievement compact dates for as deadlines as well?
It will not. It only impacts K-12 and the ESD compacts. So
We'll have two phases of achievement compact data.
exactly, we'll have two phases, and the community college and university compacts are coming in now as we speak. We've received some already, and we will. My colleague Hilda Roselli will likely have a report for you on those next meeting.
Any questions?
I think it's good timing for K-12, just in terms of beginning of the year, get your data, start working with your schools, so.
Yeah, it'll be good.
I might add that there was a strong recommendation from K-12 to kick it back to the fall implementation. So this was one that we've vetted for quite a while, and I think it's going to be very well received.
Just a question on communications. When do you expect to get the communication out?
Hopefully really soon, like in the next day or so.
Okay.
Yes.
I know colleagues in my area keep asking.
Yes.
Do I have to get it in, or do I have more time? And I keep saying, you're going to have more time.
Right, right.
Thank you.
Now we're going to turn this over to Dr. Cruz, who's going to speak to our semifinalists for the U.S. Presidential Scholars Program.
Thank you, Governor. I don't believe that either of these two students are here, but I want to mention them. This is a program that many of you may know, having been established many, many years ago to recognize some of the most distinguished graduating high school seniors. And particularly to recognize some of the students' talent in visual and creative and performing arts. About 141 students that were named as presidential scholars, and the two from our state include the following: Sophia Keskis from Cleveland High School in Portland, and Raghav Tripathi, who is from Westview High School, also in Portland. Those two students, while not here, should at least be recognized in name at least. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We also have a finalist for the Doodle for Google Oregon. And she's unfortunately having difficulty finding our location. We don't know whether she has done a Google map search or not. But we are going to just move on, and then we will come back to that when she arrives. She is striving to join us. The next agenda item is the OEIB subcommittee accomplishments and discussion of sort of where we want to move next year. Dr. Crew will lead that. I just want to make a couple opening comments. The committees we have right now are policy and governance, best practices, equity and partnership, and investment. I think the Chief Education Officer will be recommending some changes in those subcommittees going forward. But I just want to create a bit of a context here by reminding you that really there are just two overarching missions and bodies of work that only the OEIB and the Chief Education Officer can do. Without this structure, this work just doesn't get done. And the first one is creating a deeper P through 20 connections. As you know, we've got the Early Learning Council focused on early childhood. We've got the HEC focused on post-secondary education. We've got the State Board of Education and the Department of Education focused on K through 12. But it is only the OEIB and the Chief Education Officer can actually help forge closer connections and make sure that these different parts of our system are well connected at the key transition points. And specifically, we envision that the OEIB through the Chief Education Officer uses his authority to pull the P through 20 system together around some key connection points. One is a common data system. One are regional compacts that actually reflect shared objectives and strategies and goals. And then state policies that create better pathways for students, a seamless transition from pre-K to K, more dual credit in college opportunities in high school, clear transfer policies within the system of post-secondary education, and then better connections between this education system and workforce. So that's very, very important to achieving our 40-40-20 vision, and no one is really tasked with that in the system except the Oregon Education Investment Board and the Chief Education Officer. The second area is developing investment strategies to actually achieve 40-40-20. And I think probably the single biggest idea behind the OEIB is based on a belief that not only do we need to better capitalize our system of public education, but we actually have to develop a different method of resource allocation so that those dollars we do invest actually are transforming the system and leading to better outcomes. And so, again, the OEIB and the Chief Education Officer have the singular responsibility of providing for the governor, the legislature, the public and local educational institutions a model and recommendations for a better resource allocation policy that's aligned with trying to achieve 40-40-20. And that means that we have to be engaged in answering some of the bang for the buck questions, not all of which are easy. Where along the continuum do we need to increase investment, and where along the continuum should we perhaps consider reducing investments? What strategies are there that the state should be investing in directly? Things like, I would say, STEM, things like teacher effectiveness. And then how do the resources that we are allocating, how can they be used to address patterns of inequity that we've seen for too long based on race and language and geography and income. And then finally, whether and how we would use outcome-based incentives to actually maximize outcomes for education funding. I'll just say finally that most of that work, the actual work, is going to be adopted in terms of policy by the legislature and other boards and implemented through a variety of agencies, the Oregon Department of Education or OSAC or the Learning Council. But that work actually has to be shaped and led, and I think driven by this board through the Chief Education Officer. So I just wanted to provide that as sort of a big context in which the work of these various subcommittees would be nested.
Thank you, Governor. This item and the one that on your agenda is listed as a 2:45 timeframe item really should be thought of as working in tandem. The first portion here, the item before us right now, really is asking for each of the committee chairs as listed to essentially just simply give an account of what happened in their policy and or best practices committee, equity committee, etc. But what happened in those committee meetings that you feel really would be a good highlight for the board to understand the sort of seminal pieces of the work that happened over the course of this year. And then almost as a corollary to that, then what are the reasonable, tangible, clear set of connections and or deliverables that people should be thinking about going into the next year being able to do. As the governor pointed out, my recommendation that we'll talk about at the next item on 245 is a recommendation that essentially speaks to the continuity of subcommittee work from one year to the next. And based upon that, I've made some recommendations, in some cases based almost exclusively on conversations that I've had with some of you, or conversations that we've had in the past, and or just my own thinking about how to structure those subcommittees so that there's a tighter ownership of the real work that this board both is doing, as the governor just pointed out, but also it's the real work of being able to share this more broadly in the overall state. So without further ado, if you would not object, my hope would be that for just going down the items here, if you would just simply speak to the topic of how and what accomplishments have taken place over the year, and where do you think that now situates or leaves us as we then turn the corner going from this year into next?
Okay. So let's see, who we had, David was chair of the investment subcommittee, is that right? Just trying to identify who we want to
That's
speak.
correct.
Okay, why don't you start with you?
Okay. Yeah, it's hard to be on an investment committee when there's not a lot of willpower in the state to make the investment, to be blunt. Probably not the one you want to start out with now, but you've called on me. It was disheartening, and I think, well, if you look at the mechanisms in the state, too, we do not make the investment decisions. And when you're talking about allocation and more bang for the buck, I think with the realization that the funding, the chronic disinvestment was so bare bones as it was, there wasn't a lot of room to really make recommendations for investment. I mean, especially when we saw the all too real consequences were just cutting some resources to make those investments would have just meant higher class sizes or higher tuition for students. So I think, you know, going forward with this, there's got to be, and I don't think it's really more bang for the buck all the time, because I think in some sectors, certainly not all in education, but in some sectors you find it is really cut bare to the bone. And there isn't really, I think, very, very little efficiency you're going to find. I think what it should be talking about is more what's the best investment to make and for what reasons. And the real key is how to drive that in the state when this board does not make those decisions itself. But how can this board be a focus point for that conversation and really trigger those conversations, because it hasn't been. So I would suggest moving forward that any committee that's talking about allocation or better investment, really looking at what are the drivers for success too. I find too often a lot of the conversation goes to anecdotal or just kind of commonly accepted things. To really look at what those drivers are for success, and to think of ways that this board can have an influence on that conversation in the state, because I don't think it's really set up in the state for that. So that's my comments, Governor.
Well, they're good comments, and I think they're spot on, and I also want to acknowledge David's participation in the 10-year budget process. You know, it's my hope, and one of the reasons I feel so strongly about actually getting this package done with some changes in the retirement system and some additional revenues, is it could actually create a pretty robust budget that we haven't seen for really a decade, and put us in a position, if our economic growth continues forward, to have that space that David pointed out we really haven't had, to talk about real investment and transformational funding strategies and you know, a look at the formula. I will just add something that I think is actually very hard to do. If you just look at the potential savings, now I'm making some assumptions here. One is that we do make some changes to reduce the UAL and the PERS system, and that one of the sources of funding for the new revenue is capping or someone modifying the senior medical deductible. For those of you who don't know what that is, Oregon is the only state in the nation whereby everybody over 65, regardless of their income, gets to deduct all of their out-of-pocket medical expenses, whether you are in poverty or very, very wealthy. The problem with that, of course, is that as the sort of the baby boom elephant in the python moves through the system, the cost of that is just going to eat us alive. So the PERS savings system-wide, this biennium, 900 million, the following 969, following biennium 1 billion, the next biennium 1.2 billion. Senior medical 109, this is just general fund, to 140 to 177 to 220. The changes we've already made in the healthcare system, this is just Medicaid only. This doesn't assume that we get public employees and teachers actually into a similar care model. 100 million this biennium, 200 the one after that, and then 400 and 600. So what we've created here, if we can pull this off, is not only, I think, a really significant investment, and with the additional 80 for post-secondary education, we've really created a real education budget and a significant increase in early childhood, and it's a budget that we can sustain. And as the economy continues to grow, and as we be able to move some of maybe our public workforce into a different care model, you're really in a position to drive those investments. And so I think that what David said is absolutely right. We need to think about how this board plays a more active role in shaping those investments and making those recommendations before the next budget comes along, because I really do believe we're going to have a lot more daylight in that budget to make these kinds of investments. Nicole, are you on the phone?
I am on the phone.
Do you have the capacity and wherewithal to give us a little update on the Equity and Partnership Subcommittee?
I do, but actually, Dr. Samuel Henry is our acting chair of the Equity Committee, so I want to defer to his leadership at this time. I'm a hiatus Equity Committee chair right now, so I will certainly chime in, Dr. Henry, if you need help, but I think he's prepared to make remarks today.
Well, judging from his face, he's somewhat surprised, but we know that he will rise to the occasion.
Thank you, Governor. As acting, and I hope my other colleagues will chime in. I think there are 4 bits that we need to talk about in terms of subcommittee accomplishments, and that would be, I hope, fairly obvious, the equity lens, the brief on disproportionate discipline, the English language learner brief, which we are still working on and worked on in a draft this morning, and the Equity Advisory Committee, which our staff member, Dr. Darcy McEwen, has really worked hard to both assemble and to focus in terms of the issues we're looking at. Obviously, when we get to the 245, we have some challenges, but I would also add a piece of the conversation that we had this morning with Chancellor Rose, which was very heartening in terms of opening up a whole level of dialogue and conversation about some of the issues that impact post-secondary education that we hope will be part of a joint conversation, both with pre-K through 12, the community colleges, and with the university system. My colleague, do you have additional pieces? He said, turning to...
For an ad hoc report, that was pretty comprehensive coverage of what we've done over the last year.
Yeah.
And I just echo the remarks about the conversation this morning with the OUS system on diversity and equity lens. I think it's going to be a great launching pad for the work ahead.
So do you have any thoughts about sort of priorities for moving this work forward in the next year or so?
We had a plurality of points, and what we have undertaken to do in the next couple of weeks through the work of Dr. McEwen is to prioritize and to, in a systematic way, to prioritize where we want to go. We know we have 3 more of the briefs that we're scheduled to hear and then bring to this group. But the actual next points remain still a little bit unfirm at this point, with out-of-school youth and youth development being one of the next points that we really want to wade into.
Yeah, just to add to that is part of the discussion of the reluctance this morning to identify the sort of short list for next year was to get feedback from staff and some recommendations on what are the highest leverage, since there's a lot of work to do in this area, and which initiatives would have sort of the most impact on student achievement, closing the achievement gap. So that should be, as Dr. Henry said, done over the next month.
Questions? Comments about that? Okay, Yvonne?
Okay, I'll make a couple comments and then I'll see if Michael has anything to add or anybody else on the committee. I have identified a few areas that I think we could actually say we've delivered on. When we started on the Best Practice and Innovations Committee, I think the first thing facing us were all the recommendations around the Achievement Compact, which included taking a look at the timeline as well as some of the metrics and the targets. And we heard from many stakeholder groups and made those changes early on. I think that helped to get that information out as committees were forming to set their targets. With regards to the Regional Compact, I think what we sprang to next was the conversation about regional compacts, because as we looked at the Achievement Compacts, what I would say is that I think we were dealing with a little bit of sort of residue from the No Child Left Behind and the AYP and this sort of feeling of there was a sanction approach. And so it was an opportunity to start to shift the conversation that what we really want to do is look together as a state at best practice and see how we can see where that excellence is happening across the state and scale that up. So in the conversation about the targets, I think what we did is own that, yes, it's important to look at those targets, and how could those targets now move us to work more collaboratively with regional partners. So thanks to a lot of work from staff, specifically Michael, there was a lot of work done in taking a look at what was going on around the state. This is actually, I think, a practice we should continue to use on this panel, and that is to look outside and see where those exemplary practices are already happening. And we were able to do that with the Regional Compact idea, to look at some regions where they were already doing that kind of work, have them come and present so that we as a committee could learn more about that instead of trying to reinvent what we thought something like that should look like. And we were looking at a best practice model that had research behind it. So I would say that we're moving forward on that. It's a very complex idea, and I think it's going to be shaped by the members of who participate in those regional compacts. But I would say that some of that work is already, was started actually before it came to best practices, but I think it's moving forward. Another area I would say that we delivered on was the development of a statewide EL plan. That was really exciting for me, having started that work in with Hillsborough and other school districts about 3 years ago. It was really great to see that come to a statewide plan and to get support at ODE with a staff member who will own that, as well as ODE, and help us move that forward. I think there's a huge potential as we look to the key funding initiatives going forward with the idea of the networks. We have seen the development of that idea of the teaching professional development networks. And in my mind, I don't know how others in the committee might weigh in and explain this, but in my mind, the way we are starting to look at the networks, some of the strategies in the EL plan, that early learning hubs, all of those have a real collaborative approach to it, and this idea of let's work together on identifying what's excellence and figuring out how we will scale that up across the state. So I think there's opportunity in this committee to start to keep track of what do we see as those common understandings and learnings across those different pieces of work and find out how we integrate them. To me, that's really, really hopeful work. Because in the state, I think before we've created initiatives and different plans and we've gone down these different trails, but there really wasn't anybody to oversee where do those things cross over or should cross over, where do we have the cumbersome barriers and challenges that we start to build up. Hopefully by having that work come through OEIB, that might be some of the role of that panel. And the last one I'll just mention that I think could be part of the work of the best practices in innovation is the work around STEM or STEAM. As a descriptor for this committee, best practices in innovations, I think that it could be sort of a place for bringing all the learning and the knowledge about what's happening in the state around basically everything that's impacting the teaching and learning piece. So I don't know if my colleagues on the committee would add anything.
I'd just like to say how much life I think the regional compacts have brought forward. I just looked at our region, and we have a new president of University of Oregon, and we immediately started collaborating with him. I think it really is symbolic of the 0 to 20 pathway, the P20 pathway. And, the work is hard, and when you've got these partners really working together, it not only, I think, leverages us, our children along the pathway, which is most important, but it really gives this sort of notion about being in it together and moving together and just feeling like we can do it. So I know this is talking about accomplishments, and for me, one of the greatest is the regional compacts, because I see it taking the compacts we were all committed to, but really finding a vehicle by which to make them very powerful. I think it's very symbolic of what we've been trying to do since Senate Bill 909.
What's interesting is each one of us have a different take on it independently, and I was going to talk about the Regional Achievement Compacts too. That was the biggest, accomplishment yet future work we have in front of us, because I think it really gives us an opportunity to define our loose tight and have and these pilots and what we're trying to move forward with, to really listen to the region saying these are the indicators, these are the areas, these are the groups of kids we want to impact the most. And what I also saw too is the alignment between some of the work in regions with regional solutions. You're talking about the same people involved now. And what I saw in this effort this year is it isn't just a P20 education conversation, but we're bringing in our CCOs. We're bringing in our county government. We're bringing in Department of Human Services. Chambers. And this is the only way we're going to truly move 40-40-20 forward, is when we have all of these entities working as a unit. And I think the potential to do this within the Regional Achievement Compacts as a structure really needs to be a priority for us in the coming year.
And the learning we can do between regional compacts, I think one thing I've learned from your compact, just from having them present in conversations, which is something I can barely talk about without crying, is that in his community, every time a child takes out a textbook from the library, money's put in a banking account for college. That's pretty sensational. And since I've heard that, I've talked about that in my community, and you can see people are getting excited about that. And there's more to it than that too, right? But I just think it's not only we're all excited in our regions, the learning across regions is going to be very powerful. And it's a scale-up strategy that we'll have across the whole state. So I think we need to celebrate that.
I'll just add that we had, Jada came to, actually it's a learning collaborative every month with the 15 coordinating organizations, and she and Pam Curtis came and made a presentation. And it's really interesting to watch those organizations from where they were 6 months ago. Each one, there is more energy and more excitement and more partners they've discovered in the community and more connections with things that didn't used to traditionally be thought of as healthcare. And the change is actually accelerating, and there's much broader ownership for the change. And I think the exact same thing could happen if we could set up these regional achievement compacts and have the same kind of learning collaborative where they get together on a regular basis. And there's just huge overlap. I mean, the stuff that they're doing in the early childhood space has an impact on the public safety system, on the educational system, on the social service system. So I think you're absolutely right. We actually have, I'm sure there's Rudy could probably answer this, but I'm sure there's a parallel to this. We have a set of statewide metrics, outcome metrics, performance metrics, access metrics, and we just published, are going to be publishing it quarterly for the coordinating care organizations. And if you check on the website, they've just published the first baseline data. So it's got where everybody is, and then what the state benchmark is for having people in primary care, patient-centered primary medical care homes. And each month, each quarter, that's going to come out, and you're going to see the progress. And then at the learning collaboratives, we find out, well, why are you making more progress than we did, and what can we do differently? So it's a very elegant and community building tool. So Matt is not here. Who else is on the Governance and Policy Committee that we talk a little bit about?
Mary is too.
It's like I'm
Julia.
one.
And then Mary's on it too. So.
Okay, Mary.
Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't met in a while, but Mary,
Your work is done, right?
we did a lot of pre-work. Mary, why don't you jump in? But we did a lot of pre-work before the session started around the higher ed piece. which is really our focus, and to set things up for the legislative session, and also to look at some of the alignment issues that have been created, alignment integration issues that have been created through just the creation of OEIB and the legislation of creating the Chief Education Officer position. Mary?
Yeah, we had, I think, 3 or 4 meetings in December and January, and the focus was on the governance and coordination issues for the system, mostly focused on the university institutional boards, although also looking at the state structures and prepared proposals that were moved into legislation and are still winding their way through the legislative process. So we'll see how that comes out. I think there's still quite a bit, in my opinion, of policy work that needs to be sorted out, but maybe appropriately waits until after the legislative session is over, as well as I think part of our focus was to be the design of the 0 to 20 system and the relationship between OEIB and all the other governance and coordinating structures like the HEC and the State Board of Education. So I think there's a huge body of work still to be done there, but I expect that it will be taken up once we see how all this plays out in legislation.
Questions, comments on that? Agree?
Thank you, Governor. Thank you all for your comments. What I said earlier was that those comments then actually provide the sort of footing for this next item, which essentially is just the issue of what then, as we get smarter, better, more efficient, more clear about deliverables going into the next year, what should those deliverables be in terms of the subcommittees? What will be I think someone said the right word, what will be the drivers of that body of work? And how, if not these committees, are there others that we essentially should consider as a way of being able to ensure that the OEIB board's significance to this work is really felt through its ownership of these subcommittees and the work that these subcommittees are doing in relation to the field. And so very quickly, what I'd like to do would just be to turn your attention to the draft document that's been provided to the board proposing subcommittee restructuring for 2013-14. And I'll be brief in this, but I do want to make sure, first of all, that you recognize it's just a draft. It's not intended for, it should not be understood as anything in concrete at this point. It's just as a point of departure for our conversation today. First, let me just tell you that in terms of the governance and policy work, one of the things, as I spoke directly with the chair of that committee, Matt essentially said, you know what, Rudy, what I'm really concerned about going forward is how the OEIB owns this work and how they essentially put their imprimatur on that work so that the state actually both understands the role of OEIB, but more importantly is clearly being led by the energy and focus of this body. So the deliverables are appropriate to those comments. What I would say to you that I've done in each one of the subcommittees is to embody the work, and I think David said this right, embody the work of the notion of branding or marketing or sharing the information. I'm not sure either one of those words is the correct one, but how do we actually as a board start talking to the larger and broader community about this work? And most importantly, how do we then actually get the investments clear from each of these committees as to what should be the investments going into the next biennium. So you'll see that that's actually reflected in each of the subcommittees here. The scope of work is as it is. The guiding questions for each one essentially is intended to just do that. It's completely your call as to whether or not these can, at this point, correctly or accurately reflect the thinking of the chairs and committee members. What I thought with respect to the best practices in innovation is very much what Yvonne just talked about, in the sense that this is really an opportunity for us to take all of the initiatives, each one of the initiatives, everything we've done in ELL, everything we're doing in terms of the achievement compacts, all the stuff we're doing in math, science, STEM, and so on and so forth. But wherever we've put money, somebody's got to ask and answer the question, so what happened with that money? What really are the results of being able to really see how that money was actually communicated, used, and then resulted in there being different practice? And how did we actually foot the building of new and different capacity throughout the state? That's what that is intended to provide. The equity and partnerships, what essentially was really my thought here was to just simply understand that this is now, since we created the equity lens, it's all about implementation of that. It's all about how does this state use a lens now created and a vocabulary around that lens to now start creating new and different settings for young people in the P20 context, such that we are equitably distributing not just the resources, but all of the elements of high performance to these communities and to these students throughout the entire state. That was the seminal and most important part of that. It would mean that this committee would actually start looking at things like the distribution of assets, how our achievement looks across the P20 world. And by achievement, I'm not talking about necessarily just academic achievement. I'm really talking about who's getting jobs, who's not, who's getting opportunities, who's not. What communities actually don't have a set of assets that other communities really both now are showing really good results by virtue of having. How do we really start thinking about this question of staffing high and best performing people in underrepresented communities and so on and so forth. The last committee is a new one. I'm proposing that there be a growth and results committee. This really speaks to the larger issue of where the governor actually, I think, made his first comments about there sort of being a bang for the buck. And this is going to be an interesting one in the sense that, you know, every time we talk about something like this, people immediately say, well, but it's not just about the hard numbers. And this is really an attempt to say, it's both by definition, its name, and the scope of work. It is intended to say, you're right, it is not about just the hard numbers, but we can't ignore the hard numbers either. It is about soft data measures that are indicators of what's happening in terms of the hard numbers. It's about how the organization is growing. It's about how people and the capacity of those organizations is growing. It's about how whether or not there are leaders and more new and different and more diverse leaders coming into the fold and how that's growing. It's about the attainment of some of the work that the network is intended to develop, which is more and more teachers who are, or more and more people who are interested in becoming teachers and thus entering into the field in this state. And so all the organizational outcomes as well as all the people, if you will, hard data outcomes are really subsumed in this notion of being a subcommittee of growth and results. No one is named here. It's obvious that the governor and or others will either by declaration or by appointment decide as to who will go on this. But as you see, that's the scope of work. It really is looking at, you know, what did we see in the way of these numbers, and thus should we essentially believe that there's a real return on investment as a result of that. And it's really looking at the hydraulics of what did you invest and what did you get for that investment from the standpoint of dollars and cents. So, Governor, I'll turn it back over to you at this point.
Any questions? Yes, Yvonne, and then
I have a question about the growth and results. A long time ago, 2 years ago, I guess, when we started the OEIB, we talked about the longitudinal database work. And I guess I would make an assumption, maybe it's a question about, I know that's not the most important part of the work, but it is the base part of the work. So if we don't have the longitudinal database pieces in place, then we continue to struggle within the organizations, within the levels, but then across organizations and across all the entities to be able to share data. So I'm just wondering, were you thinking that that will be a place where we continue to keep our eye on the work of the longitudinal database?
Yes. The idea of being able to, I mean, this did not assume that the longitudinal database will be in place. This assumes it'll be a work in progress. Okay. It also assumes that the data points that we have for this year that we built the strategic plan off of, since we have the data points already, we can go back and find out what's really happening, at least on those data points, because the system is already pegged to be able to do that. What it doesn't have survey data, for example. It doesn't have soft data measures that we really do want to know. How are people both feeling about this movement and transformation, but also are they growing? Is the system growing? Part of the dilemma has been statewide that what we've got to build in the state is the capacity to do this. That's why, as Nancy was just saying a minute ago, just seeing the value of the regional compacts is that it's causing everybody to bring an A game to the table, so to speak. And so what we want to use the Growth and Results Committee for is actually assessing the degree to which the organization or institutional muscle is being developed, but also are we actually getting some real return on investments in terms of the manifestation of that in student growth and so on and so forth. So, it assumes that the longitudinal database is going to eventually come into play across all of these, but we've got to just go with what we've got right now.
So if I could just follow up with one comment, and that is that I think there will be a lot of opportunity to work between the best practices and innovations and that committee, because I know we've already identified some very clear places where we know it's just a matter of somebody making a decision. I'll give an example on the EL plan. We know that what we need to do is capture data when students enter the program and keep the data on those students all the way through the program and not drop them just because they exited the ELL program. That's an easy one. That's a matter of coming up with a sort of definition and then just saying we're going to keep that in the system and data. So that's just one example, but I'm sure we will start to keep our eye on what is it that we need from the best practices panel to be in the longitudinal data warehouse or data work in order to be able to measure our progress on those things.
Yes, Governor. Is it possible, for the individuals that are outside of this room, two things. One is that the governor's chart of Oregon higher education, is it possible to map that out where it looks like in the boxes, so when someone asks me, I understand you're on the OEIB board, can you explain it to me? That'd be a real help. And then
what's your answer today?
Right, exactly. And number two is I know there's a balance to what I'm going to say is, but we need to keep score. For us to sell what your initiative, what you just reported on, we really need to do that. But we get pushback because I don't think we tout the improvements that we have. We hear the negative, but we don't hear the improvements. And so this is old-fashioned and what have you, but keep score. We need to know the improvements that we're doing, and that way I think we'll have an easier time with the election process, and then also have with the grassroots. I think it's a communication that we need to really do outside of this building. And we can use this in a negative way too. To be where we started out at in the 40-something or other in education between the 50 states, we're going to improve on that. And we're going to improve on that. So let's do that, but let's show that, and then we can gen excitement and attitude towards what we're all about, and not have that pushback, well, you guys are doing whatever, the bureaucracy of that. I think down at the 7-Eleven store, they want to be number one, and so I think we need to push that.
I think there's good comments, and on the post-secondary education piece, we've got two bills moving through the legislature, and we don't quite know what they're going to look like when they come up the other side. But that will, at the end of that, we will be able to show you sort of what the relationships are, and I think both the particular Governance and Policy Committee will be able to do some additional work then once we sort of get the legislative product.
And maybe just to follow up on that growth and results deal, where do you apply for that committee assignment? I think
that's the next order.
That would be a real good.
Governor, I hear him volunteer.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, I can't fill out that out. I'm not even on one of these subcommittees.
So what I was going to do is
the results.
I would keep the But I understand that Rudy said we're getting rid of the investment committee as a committee, but we're going to ask each of the subcommittees to keep an eye on those investment strategies. So we have Matt Donegan is currently chairing the governance and policy, and Yvonne is chairing best practices and innovation. If you're willing, Matt's willing because he's not here, to keep those subcommittees, and Nicole, or Sam, and whatever Ruder wants to choose. But I would recommend keeping the current committee chairs. We'll need a new chair of the Growth and Results Committee, and then if you could just email to staff, to Seth, your preference for what committees you want to be on, we'll get those forward. I would just like to, since we're a little bit ahead of schedule, I would just like to go around and see if any of our, what is your official term? Are you an advisor, Rob? Jada? Everyone else? Just see if you have any comments or questions for the good of the order. You know, what your little report in, since we're a little ahead of schedule, because I know you're all out there working hard. So, Rob looks like he's thinking, so Jada's always quick on the feet. Bob as well.
Why don't you go ahead, John?
Would you like us to report in on some of the work that we're doing?
Just sort of your progress and just a little quick update for the OEIB on the work that you're doing down in the trenches every day.
We have an early learning council meeting tomorrow, and so Dick will report out on everything that happened today. I think that we're moving along in terms of, we had a hearing this morning, and like Ben said, the 2013 is moving forward, so we're busy developing the criteria of what the early learning hubs will look like as the session finishes and puts its finishing touches on what we're going to do legislatively. So what I'd like to do is share at the next time the timeline of what those would look like in terms of the statewide application come out, and all the communities will be involved. It will be tied in with the CCOs and hopefully awarded in the November timeframe. Hear that? So that's the big work of the council.
So we're busy at the Oregon Student Access Commission, spending the last of the 11-13 Oregon Opportunity Grant money, making sure every dime of that gets in the hands of students. And we've already started the awarding process of the 13-15 money to the students that applied in January for this coming fall. Lori Ellis, who's our Aspire coordinator, is way ahead of the legislature in getting the Aspire program ready to go. If your House Bill 3120 passes, she's ready to go for an expansion statewide. We're having to hold her back. Our scholarship program, we had a really good scholarship season this year. Distributed about $16 million in private money to students all across the state. We went through a redesign of our software. We're going back to the drawing board and improving that again for next year. But I think that all's going well. So, greetings from Eugene.
Thank you. Dr. Rose?
Thank you. Well, most importantly, we're poised here to confer over 20,000 degrees across the 7 institutions, which is very exciting. I'll be doing my world tour, or at least the Oregon tour of commencements here very shortly. So that's the most important thing, and the most exciting thing is to see those students cross the finish line. A few other things, as I told the Equity and Partnerships Subcommittee this morning, the work of the Board of Higher Ed and the Chancellor's Office is largely focused around re-engaging the questions around diversity and inclusion, and we had a very robust conversation this morning, which I appreciated greatly. We will also be adopting at the State Board of Higher Ed meeting on June 21st our 40-40-20 strategic framework, which I've discussed with Rudy, of which I'm very proud. And we've put some stakes in the ground around how we intend to earn our 40 in the state of Oregon, and I will be pleased to come in and brief this body on that work when it's appropriate. We will be commencing a national search for a new president of Western Oregon University, and which Hilda, of course, is aware of. I've spent a lot of time on that campus doing stakeholder interviews with over 200 members of that community to listen to them and their aspirations for their institution. And finally, as the governor is well aware, I am walking the halls of Salem, trying to get our budget and capital approved for our 7 institutions, and fingers crossed on a grand deal that will help us get some tuition right now.
Great, thank you.
Keith over here.
Hi.
Oh, there you are. Sorry.
Keith Bain, Deputy Director of Teacher Science and Practices. I'm sitting in for Vicki Chamberlain, the Executive Director. I'll talk about 5 kind of key initiatives we have going. The Commission is working on licensure redesign, looking at our multiple systems of licensure in K-12 system and coming up with one system that makes sense and that really contributes. So that work is moving along and is being fast-tracked, actually. We're also working with all of the higher ed institutions, public and private, talking about some common statewide teacher performance assessments across all programs, which also then leads into the discussion about statewide accountability measures, some common ones across all preparation programs. We're also beginning the conversation with several programs and school districts around dual language and how to prepare educators that are qualified to go into K-12 schools where it's dual language or immersion or bilingual. And so right now there's really a lack of supply of educators in that area. So we're beginning to have that conversation of what do we need to be doing to create the supply to meet the demand. And then also continuing our work along with the ELL Collaborative and the work on how do we develop the competencies within the incoming workforce, pre-service educators, but also in service by working in partnership with the school districts so that our educators could better meet the educational needs of the English language learners.
Iris?
As Ben mentioned, our bill passed out of subcommittee on Ways and Means this morning, and so that will establish us over at the Department of Ed. We are working with Rob, I meet bi-weekly with him now with respect to that transition over to the Department of Ed. Our next Youth Development Council meeting is on June 20th, and we've invited Dr. Ewan to come and share the equity lens document with us with the idea that we would adopt that lens and utilize that with respect to Youth Development Council and the continuity with respect to the board itself. And I also heard Dr. Henry mention that there is a desire to look at how we might make those targeted investments around specific youth populations, particularly those youth that we're trying to reconnect educationally. So that particular connection will be another one that we will be looking to do. So we have our work cut out for us this year with respect to the transition of the Youth Development Council into the Department of Ed, and working with and have several meetings set up with the Department of Ed and with staff there to look at how we coordinate and connect with the Department of Ed around some key specific areas of work, whether it's the runaway youth, disconnected youth, dropouts. We also just recently participated in a press conference called Healing Hurt People with Emmanuel Hospital, which is a national model that they're using around gangs with respect to doctors and those who work in trauma units. And so we are also looking at how we connect with that particular model around the state with respect to the gang activities and gang involvement. It's a very comprehensive model that's getting results, and so that's another thing that we're looking at. What kinds of programs and investments will get us the results that we're looking for? So a lot of work underway, a lot of work yet to be done.
Very good. I was just checking with Ben. We had a quick sort of overview of the budget today, and I believe $1 million that we have in there for that work is still remains in the budget.
Yes, it's still there.
Oh.
Governor, thank you for starting down that way, so I have a chance to make my list here. I appreciate that very much. And it's a pretty good list. So we are, as you all know, we did a presentation here this last winter on what the department's strategic plan looks like. And that strategic plan mirrors very closely on student outcomes with OEIBs, and then there's some additional work that's within there. But we set out a list of fairly aggressive 6-month metrics, and we're just now coming up on the 6 months. So July 1 would be 6 months, and we'll be putting together a report on where we land on each of those, but it's looking very, very good, so it's coming along quite nicely as far as those targets are concerned, which would get us to our July 1, 2015 targets. We also are involved, one of the metrics that we had within there was a reorganization of the Department of Education where we break down some of the silos that have existed previously, and we've promised that we'll have that reorganization done by August, and we're on target to do that probably in mid-August, and we think that we'll be a more efficient organization when we're done with that work. We've been out in the state this year supporting school districts on their implementation of Senate Bill 290, which really has to do with teacher and administrator evaluation in a different way. And districts are required after July 1st to be evaluating teachers and administrators in the district using the precepts set forward in Senate Bill 290. And I think that it's been interesting. For a while there was the idea that that didn't need to be done until July 1, 2014, and the fact that we moved that up to 2013, I really think has pushed districts and moved that work in a much faster way than it would have been, and really in a pretty admirable way as districts have responded. So we're engaged in that. We've been supporting focus and priority schools across the state. We are at the end of really the first year where we've gone in and helped them do an evaluation as to how they might improve, what actions they might take to do that, and supporting them in that work. They've turned in their plans, which have been either approved or denied at this point in time, and they're in the process of gearing up for actual implementation of those plans, which should change student outcomes for some of our schools that have been lowest performing and have the most number of high poverty students in their schools. And so that's been a good piece of work. It's one that we're currently putting under review because we think there's some room for improvement even within that process, and feel good about the work that's been done there. We are ramping up an equity division at the Department of Education, which we've not previously had. There are 198,000 students of color in the state of Oregon, and we have 2.25 FTE at the department to work on any issue around equity, and that's all been federally funded. If things move forward in this legislative session as our plan, we'll have a department that would be about going out and working with districts as a support organization and not just compliance, and working on ramping up the EL plan, working with districts on matters of equity, and give us an opportunity to work with districts again around support as opposed to just compliance around equity, which is a really good piece of work, and we have David Bautista, assistant superintendent, now hired up to lead that. We've been supporting districts as they work to implement the Common Core curriculum across the state, and there are some pieces in 32, 33 that would help us do that work, and we're continuing with that. Districts, I know, are highly engaged in it, and I think it's really important for us as we have that conversation that we make sure that we're talking about the college and career readiness aspect of the Common Core, so that people in the state and really even across the nation begin to appreciate what it is that the Common Core is about, and a new set of higher standards that we have our students prepared for their future in a different way than they had been previously. We're in the process of gearing up to deliver the kindergarten readiness assessment to all kindergarten students this fall, and been working very closely with JADA on that. And that's coming along. We'll be able to actually deliver on that this fall, and it will start to give us some different pieces of information than we've had before. We have completed a new Oregon report card as required by our waiver from No Child Left Behind. And that report card is done and mocked up and adopted by the state board, with the exception of the district report card, which will happen at the upcoming board meeting. And we've started collecting the data pieces that will be required to actually put that out to the public and have the data make sense based on the new components of the report card. We have officially adopted in the past month and at the last state board meeting the Smarter Balanced Assessment as the assessment that we would use to compare student achievement to the Common Core set of standards. And we've begun preparing to deliver on a pilot of the Smarter Balanced Assessment for about 60% of students in the state of Oregon for next spring. We've been working closely with both JADA and IRIS in infusing the Early Learning Division and Youth Development Division into the Oregon Department of Education. There's a big piece of work around that. I'd like to commend them for their work and say a thank you to all the people who've been a part of that. And then lastly, we are, in the work of trying to support certainly House Bill 3232 and 3233, and those are up for hearing on Thursday. But more importantly than that, making the assumption that there are going to be significant pieces of work that come out of their passage, and beginning to think about and bring people together to talk about the RFPs that will be required, the staffing that will be required, and actually begun to do the work so that we can begin to deliver on what's in 3232 and 3233 by July 1 and have a significant part of that work ready to go come September 1st when school starts, and then some more of that done in December and perhaps in February, so that we can get those out the door and have educators across the state and other partners across the state actually making a difference about the kind of outcomes we're going to achieve with students. So, as I said, a big list of all very exciting and important work.
Yes, Ron?
I really love that report out, and I was just thinking about our role on OEIB as oversight of that whole strategic plan, and I was just thinking it might be a neat practice in the next year to think about all of the people who just reported out, but not just reporting out by their position or their department, but according to the strategies in our strategic plan. That would enable them to get, have a little preparation time and for us to really all keep an eye on those measures. So I know that sometimes we don't move a lot between quarters, so it wouldn't mean that we report out on everything, but where there's progress. So that's the first thought I had. The second thought was when the legislative session is finished and we actually know it gets passed, because keeping track of all these numbers, I know that Ben did a report on the ones specifically important to OEIB, but when I look at the whole 0 to 20 system, anything that has to do with any people in that group have an impact on the work that we plan to do. And it might be nice to look at the ones that passed and say, here was our intention, here's the work that's going to go with that, here's the results that we think we plan to look for and what that timeline might be. Maybe that's, I don't know, at the end of the summer or the beginning of fall, but I would really like to have a better understanding of what actually passed and how that's going to change our work.
And a lot of the 6-month goals in the OEIB plan, the OEIB plan align to that.
Yeah.
So a 6-month plan update would encompass that.
That's a great idea.
Did have, just as long as we're talking about the subcommittee restructuring the work, one thing that I just wanted to offer up that I think would be useful is a review of the transition points and how we support them as a board. Looking through it, I don't see that specifically called out. And just as for a sake of example, either a transition point or the review of the milestones. The example of is the high school diploma in and of itself, as it currently exists, the right milestone to predict whether students are ready for college or career. And we had a great discussion this morning about it because you can get a diploma from a high school in Oregon, but doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to get admitted into a university or a community college or not have to take remedial work. So I think creating this sort of integration between, I'd love to have OUS and the community colleges and the K-12 system look at how they create a push-pull so that students, it's not checked the K-12s, we've done our job because somebody got a diploma, we met the milestones, and then they may or may not be ready for the next step. So how do we create a more integration? And as part of this morning's conversation, although it was focused on higher ed, the same transition point between early learning and kindergarten. So looking at those transition points, how do we have the right metrics? Do we have the right push and pulls and the right integration between the two players versus just a handoff between the systems? And to me, that seems like that would get right to OEIB's work of the integrating the aligned K-20 system.
To add to that, I think a great place to maybe ask for that kind of report out initially will be those regional pilots where they're looking at some of those crossover points. I'm just thinking about one of the ones we're looking at in our district, and that's around kids being prepared so they're not remanded to remedial classes and the collaboration that's we're planning between Western Oregon and our school district and Hillsborough School District. And so one sort of responsibility we might put on the regional groups that are going to be the initial pilots is to report back on how the work is doing around those milestones and how they get described and who owns them. Because I think it's perfectly aligned with the regional compacts, depending on what each group is using for targets. But
That'd be great. And I'd like to get OUSs and the community colleges just as a system-wide, so that people are out of their region or go to an institution that's outside your region, just so we have a systemic approach and also a regional, to just learn from regional best practices as well.
that makes sense.
I think down there, Dick,
Yes. Also, how does other things affect us? For example, the Sentencing Commission, that type of thing. I think we should play a role in that because that affects us. And you set up the commission, Governor, and that needs to move forward on how we're going to handle the sentencing and how the education plays into that.
Yes, Dr. Rose.
If I may, I just want to respond to Julia's first point about those connectivity points, and not to belabor it because we did talk about this morning, but I would be very anxious to engage in that conversation about how OUS can be helpful in pulling students into our universities, and I would be especially interested in that conversation because it touches on issues not just related to success of those students when they get to us, but actually affordability and debt. Because one of the trends that we're beginning to see, of course, is some predictability around those students who come to us the most vulnerable in terms of academic preparation are, of course, the ones that are going to burn through a lot of resources through remediation and perhaps not even leave with a diploma in hand. So we get the worst of all possible outcomes, which is that we provide access and then perhaps don't even get to see these students as part of the 20,000 plus who cross the finish line. So I would definitely commit our office to that conversation and look forward to having it.
Yes.
We had a disappearing task force that met on the chief education officer appraisal for the year, and we met right before this, so I don't know if you want an update on that, just because the last two OEIB meetings we've talked about it.
Yes.
Mark was going to provide it.
Yeah, just a quick flyby. Basically, we started this conversation a couple months ago in March about the performance appraisal for Rudy. And so we met for the first time as kind of a skeleton crew. We had quite a few members gone today, but we worked on the draft survey, and Lisa's been doing a lot of heavy lifting on this. And we roughed it out, and we really want to get this out to stakeholders. If you remember our previous meeting, we talked about various education groups as well as stakeholders throughout Oregon to weigh in, to provide feedback on that. And we will continue to work on this. What we're looking at realistically is to get this out in July, the survey. So we'll spend the next couple of weeks. Lisa's going to play with it a little bit, maybe work with some of our communications folks in the department as well as OSPRA to help refine the survey and make it nice and clean and pretty and capturing all the the essential elements that we want for this feedback. But this board will have an opportunity this month to weigh in and provide any last-minute checks and alterations to the survey before it goes out in July. And then in parallel paths, if you remember, Rudy was going to be working over the summer on the scorecard. We're looking forward to that. So we kind of have parallel paths going where we're going to get stakeholder feedback as well as internal feedback so that we can gather as much data as possible to move forward into the fall, late summer, fall.
In addition to the committee, Rudy will get to give feedback on the survey too, and then we'll have it gone in July.
I have one other business item. I think what we'll do, if you don't object, since we're rolling along here, we've got two people who signed up to provide some public testimony. Our Doodle for Google award winner is here, so I thought maybe I would take the testimony and then we do that, we wrap it up on a very high note with our room. We are hoping to have a retreat this summer, sometime in July or August. I know that's very difficult to plan with people's summer schedules, but maybe if I could ask you to send to Seth days that you might be available in either July or August, and we can just see whether that's even going to be possible. If it is, we would use that as an opportunity, in addition to sort of strategic planning, to kind of go over what happened in the legislature, and we should hopefully will be gone by then.
Is it possible to think about our August meeting date as just being an all-day retreat rather than just a short meeting? Because it's already in our calendar.
Sure.
At some point in time, I think it would be beneficial to have a joint meeting with the Grade Learning Council also.
I think that's also a very good idea.
Yeah, that's another thing that we had promised to do, so we could either see if we can, in August, determine, or see if we can fit that into the retreat as part of it. So maybe that's the best thing to try to do.
Let's look at, and maybe we've got a July 9th meeting, which is too soon. Maybe we should look at what our August meeting is and see if maybe we can build a retreat around that and have that meeting.
We'll be glad to host in Eastern Oregon.
We're always glad to host that. Okay, we will open the public testimony. Chuck Haggins? Rex, I'm sorry. Rex from the Oregon School Boards.
I didn't mean to sign up for that.
Okay.
I thought I was signing in. I'm getting old.
You're signed. All right, you are signed in. Rex is here.
Nice to see you, Rex.
Nice to see you, Rex. Colleen Millihan from Center for Greek Public School, OEIB. Welcome.
Thank you, Governor, members of the committee. Colleen Milam, Center for Great Public Schools at the Oregon Education Association. The center really focuses on supporting teachers with their practice and professional learning. Also, it is working with teachers to bring their voice to the policy discussion. And so one of the things that we've been working on this year has been the achievement compacts. And so the intent today was just to come and share with you how we're looking forward to continued discussion on the achievement compacts and the role that they play in school improvement. Actually, with Yvonne's comments, with Whitney's report, that information is very helpful for us. We're reflecting on our work as you're reflecting on your work today, and thinking about, so how can we proceed and work with teachers around those achievement compacts? And now, with the regional notion on the table, how can we connect those district compacts with the regional compacts? So just wanted to reinforce, looking forward to continued discussion around the work with the compacts. There are many other issues we're working on as well around educator effectiveness, and look forward to the partnership in that work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, with Kristen Allen from Google.
So
Yes.
really, we're here to recognize Maisie Davis
Very
and her
good.
family. Do you guys
Well,
want
why don't, Ruth, you want to lead us off, and then we'll... Why don't you come on right up here so we can all see it? Sit right down there, because you're a very special person today, and we want to honor you. That's true.
Thank you very much, Governor. This is a long-awaited and very, very special opportunity for all of us. Doodle for Google is an annual program that invites K-12 students to think big about something that's really, really important as a theme, and to use their imagination to develop that theme, to provide a way of being able to kind of both artistically and other ways talk about that theme. And so Maisie Davis of Ladd Acres Elementary School in Hillsborough was among the 50 finalists in the K-3 division, and we are very, very pleased that she is here. There was an award ceremony, as I understand it, at her school on the 1st of May, in which Dr. McEwen from my office both represented both of us in being able to extend our greatest appreciation and greetings to Maisie, and we now get an opportunity to do it as a full board.
Great, well, we're very proud of you.
Yeah.
And we'd like to see your
Show
work.
your picture.
Oh my goodness. So let's
You want to bring it over? You want to stand up? You go over there?
maybe after the governor and Dr. Krugel, so you could just walk right around here.
Show everybody.
Because we're kind of jealous, we want to see it too.
That's great. Yeah, you gotta tell them what you drew and what. And the theme was my best day ever. So this was
Wow. You got, what's on this mushroom right here? Up there, and you got like this apple here. That's great. Could we get our duck, could I get a picture? Wow. Yeah, you okay with that? Yeah, she's going to take her picture.
One.
Walk around here, show everybody your let's start with her going over a rainbow and landing in pot gold. Here, I'll just walk down here a little bit. Let's leave it here.
Nice work. Thank you for sharing. Wow. Go a little closer.
I love those colors. You want to jump right in.
The wires here. Go down the whole band here. This band.
You see that? That's great. While you're over there, ask Dr. Rose for scholarship.
Can we give her a round of applause?
Thanks.
Thank you, AG. Well, it's a great note to end on, and one of the people we're doing this for. So thank you for coming.
Governor, I know you have many fine qualities, but I think you're actually best when you deal with the youngsters. I'll tell you that.
They're very transparent. They're not hostile.
And you react to them.
But is there any additional business here? If not, we stand adjourned.